All right, thank you so much for coming to look at my mural. I'm going to speak to you without the mask because it's windy out here and masks are so, they reduce the sound so much. Okay, we're going to quick go to the corner so you guys can see that we're in downtown Empire, which is our county seat, Mendocino County, and that way you'll get an idea of a mural is. So there we go. You can see, and it's hard to see from here because we're in the sun, but we'll go into that shadow so we can see it better. It's an entire block long. This is the Ukiah Valley Conference Center. That's the front, and the side entrance is right there. So come and see. And I'm making this video just for the application, and so I really want everybody to at least start it. If it goes a little long, you can stop, but at least you'll see the beginning. So this building had a sort of a subtle, modest Art Deco look to it with that metal decoration and other aspects. And it was really important to me to blend into the building to make the mural harmonize and not overcome the building. So you can see these colors, beautiful soft pastel colors. And so this panel, oh yeah, I was supposed to tell you at the beginning, the whole thing goes all the way down to the street there, and it's split into these panels, roughly 5.5 feet wide, about 19 feet tall. And at the top, harmonizing with that Art Deco element, are the words that I wrote that are iconic words for that panel, but also somewhat universally. So here with the nature panel, and that handwriting I learned in grade school, of course. The nature panel represents the eons of thriving life in this area on this continent before human habitation. And then these next 4 panels, resourcefulness, bounty, community, and majesty, represent the millennia of native culture that developed and thrived here. Anthropologists call it, I've read, affluent and sedentary, which is sort of cool because it reflects the fact that there's so many resources here, from the salmon spawning to everything that grows in the area, that within a certain radius you would have everything you needed. And so you have a lot of depictions of activities, gathering food, working on things. These are hazelnuts, just picking wild berries. And over here, the panel called Community shows, I believe there are 20 people in this one. It's now not the most populous panel, but at the time it was. And all of these figures they're not just made up by me. So I used historic photos as much as I could, and with Native people it presents a particular challenge because not only do you not know who they are often, you don't have a name, but you also have trouble with clothing, because by the time you get photos, you have Native people who are in the presence of a Westerner at the very earliest, probably 1835, because that's when photography was invented, and they have Western clothing on. So that was a bit of a struggle, but I did the best research I could, and being a seamstress, I sort of thought, what would I do with a skin too? And so I also featured the toplessness because they weren't freaked out by breasts like Western civilization is, but I downplayed it because I didn't want it to be, you don't want it to look like a Barbie doll. And so the thing I was saying about using photos, these are real people, and sadly we don't know most of their names, but in this case, we do. This man represents an elder who's literally making money. He's creating all of these beads that are made out of these really thick clamshells that come from Bodega Bay, and they're used as money. You could exchange them for goods. And so my friend and Native advisor White Wolf James posed for this. So he's a portrait. This is a man alive right now. And beside him, I put an image of a young woman, which is from a historic photo from the collection at the Grace Hudson Museum. And she was just known in the photo as 16-year-old Pomo Girl. But when I showed him what I was using, this is a really famous photo, he said, I knew her. He knew her in later life, and he knew that her name was Frances Jack. And he said, that's who that is. So now we know who she is. And on top of that, when he saw what I'd done over here, when I painted this woman from a photo of someone doing seed beating, gathering wild seeds, he said that was her mother. So Cecilia Joaquin had already painted her mother. You know, it's so cool. And so moving into this section, we have expanse and immigration. Expanse representing the colonial period when California was under Spanish and Mexican rule. And immigration, of course it had to be the word at the top, because this was the biggest mass migration in the country's history. And it's when everything changed in this, in California too. The estimated native population before the giant immigration that, you know, came about with the gold rush, so say like 1840, let's say, was roughly 150,000, and the Caucasian population about 15,000. So, you know, a factor of 10 times 10. And within 30 years, that was flipped. And the fact that it was flipped is really a horror story. That doesn't happen naturally. All of those deaths don't just happen. They're the result of starvation and murder and disease. And so, while there's a lot to celebrate here, and, you know, wonderful settler family, this is a portrait of someone alive now. What I had to deal with next was what happened. How do you deal with a native genocide? And I knew from the beginning that this could in no way be left out. This would not be a history if I didn't account for it. So I chose to represent endurance and truth, and showing not the depravity of acts committed against the native people, but their strength, endurance, and ultimate survival. And this part you see Mother, this village has just been wrecked. Most of her tribe has been murdered, and everyone who fled has nowhere to go because the marauding Caucasians would destroy the food stores in the villages. It wasn't enough just to take lives. I mean, the ultimate goal was extermination. So she's here just sunk into unimaginable sorrow. None of us who hasn't gone through something like this can understand. But she has a child, so what do? She has to maintain for her baby. And so I showed her having snared a quail. They're roasting it on a tiny smokeless fire under a shelter of branches, which she knows how to do. And above there is the settlers' home and their life. You know, they love their families too. Their life was full and not easy, but a lot easier than this. And then in this panel, in truth, I represent that value of recognizing what has happened. I think the point of a lot of what we do, and the point of this mural, is to, at the end of all this, to arrive at something good, something ideal. And it can't happen without acknowledgement of the truth. So this is where I represent that in imagery. And I chose to represent her in the most honoring and beautiful and soft colors that I could, which contrasts with what's going on, which is the fact that she grabbed everything most precious to her, her baby and her wedding bag, which her husband would have woven for her and given to her when they got married, and she ran and she didn't make it. And so she is now dead. She is going into the other side where she will meet her husband and her other son. And you can see little hints of this on her blanket. It has red stripes, but this part is the pool of her blood. And so it's here, but it's balanced by her beauty. The fire represents three things. It represents the traditional funeral fires that the Pomo people would light when someone passed away, and they would burn their belongings or baskets. It also represents the destruction, but it also represents rising from the ashes, survival. The red-tailed hawk is the culture not being killed, the culture surviving. Hey Dave, you're going to be in this presently. Just stay there. And so these panels represent stages in Ukiah's history, administration, transportation, agriculture, and timber. And I want to focus on just this one super briefly. Administration represents, government, the court system, and it can include justice. But administration doesn't always include justice. And all these documents down here are sort of the example of this, like the state of California. Awesome. It was not a slave state. But why? Partly because African and African American slaves were really expensive by this time. The trade had been outlawed, but you could still have slaves. You needed them to reproduce, and that just doesn't happen overnight. And so they're expensive. I mean, really expensive. And California had their own. They had the natives that you could, a Caucasian could just take someone off the street and they would be indentured to them. So there's good, there's bad. It's a state. And down here, just one little thing I'll note. Technically, this is cool. It's pencil. This is a super rough surface, and I struggled with how to, it's hard to paint what markers to use. Some of them fade. Pencil doesn't fade, and when it's coated with anti-graffiti coating, it darkens. It is perfect. So this mass of documents down here represents all those treaties that were negotiated by Reddick McKee, the federal Indian agent, with the multiple tribes of California. And he and they entered into discussions in good faith, and over 3 years he came up with, I believe, over 100 treaties. And then, of course, maybe unclear to the people participating, that wasn't the end of the story. They had to go to Washington and be approved by the Congress. And the California delegation led the effort to say no, they're not approved, and to hide them. And so that's why they're blood stained. They came to nothing, and even worse than nothing, because by then the natives had traded for something that they then didn't have. Transportation, the first passenger railway train came to Ukiah in 1889. And this right there is my tiniest portrait. His face is the size of a quarter, and it's a local regional transportation professional who served the area for decades. He's the engineer there. And I honor too the Chinese tunnelers who were often given the very most dangerous tunneling jobs when the union bosses wouldn't let their regular guys go in. Agriculture, hops growing, timber, you see the slash and burn method that is so destructive, and it's how they could get stuff out of the way and then have water bearers wet the ground so you could drag those big logs out with oxen. And one little thing I want you to look at here, this is an old gas station that's still here in Ukiah. And I was painting this from photos from the 40s. And in that photo, there were cars and trucks from the 40s. And I said, oh, I've seen one of those trucks. And it's actually in this barn, which is in Copland. And I was given a tour. And so I could paint the real truck that's there, International Harvester. But I could also do something that is really fun in these murals and sort of moving, at least to me, which is to not right a wrong, but to acknowledge something. For instance, this woman who lived on that ranch became pregnant in her 20s, unmarried, and like so many women, so many that I have even talked to, was forced to go away, go through a pregnancy somewhere else. In her case, it was New York. Give birth, have the baby, immediately give it up for adoption, and wait till she got her figure back, and then come back and never tell anyone. She never told anyone. She married, she had a family, she had a full life, she died. She never told anyone. She never got to see that baby again and hold her. But, and that guy that you almost saw, who you'll see in a minute, I think here, was that lady's son. Later, after she died, that baby found them. And so she found her half-siblings, but sadly the mother never got to touch touch her again. But at least I can put them together and paint. And her brother, she is long passed away, but her brother who passed away last year, before he did, he came and he saw this, and I have a picture of him reaching out, touching her. And education, so higher education here, primary and secondary, represented by this beautiful grammar schools that they go here. But then I also want to show the learning of really high-level technical skills and other skills. That's represented by 3 generations of a local Pomo family that are expert basket weavers. And we have practical, like, household skills. That's a big part of education. This is a local couple, passed away now, but from a photo of them in the 40s. They had a cherry ranch, and here the matriarch of the family is teaching 2 kids how to make crust. And the fun thing about this is that this is a local person who became my friend, the son of that woman who had to give away her first baby. And he modeled for this, but I painted him from his high school yearbook. So he's 14, right? He's with a little girl who's like 9 or 11. This is his real granddaughter. So it's grandpa and granddaughter, but time compressed. And down here, the foundation of all education is learning from the world, learning, being a toddler, feeling the wind, learning by taste and smell and touch and sight. And this toddler is, of course, my son, who should turn that camera around just for 1 second so you can see his face. There, okay. Now, in sort of Renaissance fashion, this is the entrance we just walked past, and flanking the entrance are 2 pillars of society, education and labor. So over here I focus on Pear Orchards because that was a big deal here. And this is a local man, Jose Ruiz, who taught me all about the aspects of this this job, and he posed. So, and this was the first portrait in the mural because he's sort of up high. He was painted before all those other ones. And just about ready for you, Dave. Here, independence represents ranching lifestyle, independent lifestyle, but it's also the perfect opportunity to show the independence that you get when your vote is counted. So it includes the suffragists movement and all the details of who got the vote when, a job which is not quite finished, are on the door. And it's a real door, real hinges. It's shut, but it's painted open. Excellence represents the wine industry here with portraits of 3 iconic wine growers. And here next to it, it sort of spills over into love. And the love panel represents back to the landers, the influx of all the hippies here in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, and continuing, that changed everything here so much. And also their marijuana growing operation. Many portraits, these are all from real people, and now you're getting into the present enough that most of these people are still alive, and so I could talk to them about their experience, and they can come and see, they can send me photos and see the results, see the portraits, and I can take more pictures. Creativity, I chose to focus on dance because it's visually good, and all these are portraits, and of course I'm in here too, in Renaissance fashion. Historical Society's memorial home up there. And down here, the idea with this is to have a diverse group of people engaged in thoughtful, respectful interaction and discussion. And interestingly, this woman and this woman were running against each other in local election. And she won, and she ended up taking her seat that she had held before. compatible with your home, with your community. And this is the Palace Hotel, which is still here in total disrepair, very sad, but for decades was the center of the commercial core of Ohio. And so all these scenes take place inside the historic Palace Hotel, multiple portraits from the past, from the on TV, but you can see that in the, well, I'll just tell you, because this guy was back to the lander. They had no TV out there, of course, and he knew this was going to happen, so he came to the Palace Hotel looking for a TV, and they had one that ran on quarters, which was provided by Dave's Farmers Company. So the quarter TV is there, it looks like there's a but here, one of the other portraits, out of school. We've never had black kids here. And he did something that was very smart, I think. He didn't escalate the situation. He didn't get beaten up or worse. But he also didn't obey. And the kids stayed. The school, the classmates, the teachers, the administrators got to know him. Dave's the one who brought him to my attention because Ukiah honors its distinguished graduates. And so they got to know these kids as people, you know, as awesome people, and they rallied around it. It's not that there weren't troubles, but they ended up staying, and those people didn't push to somehow force the school to expel him, which would have been messy. So he stayed, distinguished graduate. Then he became a lawyer, but first he was drafted by the San Francisco Dons basketball team, and in those 2 years, this would have been 52 and 53, or else 53 and 54. He graduated in 52. The San Francisco Dons, with Bill Russell and him and some other players, fought or basically just rejected the unspoken rule that you can't have more than 2 black starters, and they won everything for 2 years in a row. So perfect, vindication. But the thing that made me really happy was that one of the things that happened with the team was they were refused at a hotel in another state because they had black players. And so all the players said, forget it, we're going somewhere else. They went and stayed in a dorm. So here he is, Cal Perry in his suit, perfectly welcome and at ease in the fanciest, best hotel in Ukiah. And then the very last thing I'll show you, you're going to see some white because with the delays last year, it's not quite finished, but it will finish this year. In this panel, the service panel, they had to get this in last year because, of course, we've had the pandemic, and you can see how windy it is, so I'm not wearing my mask. But normally I am, and so is everybody else. So we have to honor the medical professionals here. This is a well-known doctor who we've recognized even with his mask. And here we have our firefighters, and the air taker dropping fire retardant, CAL FIRE, and firefighters from all over who can help us. And then finally, the very last thing I'll say is the service panel. This isn't finished, but it has to include people who've served in the military. And my good friend Phil, whose portrait is in the tray and the size of a quarter, is a Vietnam vet and very involved in Veterans Affairs. years, and he helped me go through research that had been done by others into the lives of graduates who served in community action. And I thought that's the ultimate, you know, if there's a portrait of that in here, it has to be one of them. So we chose this young man, Ukiah graduate, who, you know, the story's on the website, but he had an amazing career. He was very brave in the Brown River Navy, which was the boats in Vietnam that went up the river, so incredibly dangerous. And so it will be finished. It's here in the very last. I don't know if you'll see this because of the sun, but this will be a scene of kids with an ideal city. Our values that we aspire to in this ideal world. Thank you. Thank you for listening. If you got this far, I totally appreciate it.